Welcome to Stripes and Stories, a show about life as a Pryor Tiger. I'm your host, Tina James. Today we'll be turning our attention to the classroom with Kristen Graves, the Director of Teaching and Learning.
I'm Kristen Graves, and you're listening to Teacher Talk, conversations that take us inside the thinking behind a teacher's most powerful moves. Today, we're visiting with Lori Martin, math teacher at Pryor High School. Lori, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to just kick off our conversation by asking you to fast forward down the road. When students have left your classroom, what is it that you want them to look back and say about you as a teacher?
I think the number one thing is that I'm authentic, that the learning in the classroom, that I cared about their learning the most, and I cared about them as a person, that I took time to build relationships with them and really get to know them. And it wasn't just about the math. Math is important and learning is important, but that I was interested in them and what was going on in their lives.
So, we've talked to multiple teachers on this podcast, and we always seem to circle back to relationship. And so tell me about what's the how of relationship for you? How do you balance relationships and teaching math?
That's a great question. I feel like to start the year, especially with the new students, taking time at the beginning of the year to build that relationship with them in non-curricular task activities where I can sit with them and it's not about the math. It's just about problem solving, talking to them about how their summer was, what's going on in their life, and building that trust. Because if I don't have their trust early, then it's hard for them to trust me when things get difficult in the math. And so just spending that time building relationships with them in my classroom is really important.
How do you know you've reached that point with a student where they trust you?
That's a great question too. It doesn't all happen at the same time in the classroom. And so some kids, like I have one girl in particular that comes to mind, her trust in me and our relationship happened right before Christmas break. Took a little bit longer for her. And so just being diligent in trying to reach kids where they are and build that relationship of trust, and knowing that it's different with every kid, and not being frustrated when a kid doesn't embrace it and accept you and go along with what you're trying to do. Sometimes it's difficult, but it's a necessary thing. You just have to be patient. And so I know when they hit that struggle in math and they're teary-eyed and they want to quit, and I can sit with them and say, it's going to be okay. You can figure this out. And they give into that and they continue to work and continue to be okay with the struggle, that they trust me, that they know the outcome's going to be okay, even if we're struggling in the middle.
Do you feel like struggle is a good thing?
I feel like productive struggle is a really good thing. I know that because I've been through it in math, I know there are times where you hit that wall and it's not productive anymore. So I try to be really sensitive to that with my students and try not to rescue them every time they struggle, which is really difficult when you want kids to be successful.
Absolutely.
But I also know that productive struggle is really important for their success later on down the road. And so just being mindful of where they are, and every kid is different, where they are in the struggle. Are they about to give up completely and just walk away and be angry? Or are they still in that mode where if I just give them a little hint, or I send another student over to give them a hint, they're going to be okay? Not a rescue, but just kind of a help along the way.
Has that always been, have you always been trying to get students to struggle productively as a teacher, or is that newer thinking?
So my mom was a teacher, and she was a math teacher, my high school math teacher, and she did activities and gave us opportunities to struggle productively. And so I think because I've always been around that's always been part of my game plan. I don't know that it was always at the forefront. Like as a first year teacher, I was about building relationships. I was probably more careful about that, more cautious because I was closer to kids' age. Now I'm more like mom, so it's kind of a different stage of life. But I think now it's more at the forefront of the productive struggle, and maybe because I've read more on it and researched more on it, there's more talk about it. But I do feel like that was part of my game plan to start with, was allowing kids to try to figure things out on their own without me rescuing all the time, because I'm the one doing the learning. If I'm the one doing the rescuing all the time, they're not learning anything. They're just waiting on me to rescue. So
that reminds me of a fantastic conference we attended together this summer,
Yes.
where the presenter talked about we often try to take something, make meaning of it, and give that meaning to students, when really for learning, they need to make that meaning.
Right.
But I totally agree that as a teacher, it's almost, because we're wired to help
yes.
and support, you almost have to turn that part of yourself off a little bit to allow that to happen. So when you think about your classroom, what are the strategies that, we've also talked a lot on this podcast about that teachers are constantly changing the things that they do. We're evolving over time because of the nature of our work. What are the things that are totally non-negotiable for you? You're going to always do these things because they're so powerful for student learning.
Flipping my classroom would be one of my things that I'm always going to do, hopefully, because we lay the foundation of what we're going to talk about in class. That foundation is laid, and it's not a whole lot, but it's just enough that it's not a surprise when they come to class. They're not overwhelmed. It's not new material. And so I love that part. And it's obvious when kids come in and don't, because they haven't watched the video, because they're a little bit behind the 8 ball when they walk in. And so and that's the way class would be all the time. And I don't know that they would, and maybe they would, I don't know that they would be able to engage in the material, engage a conversation with each other as much as they do if I didn't already have that established. Another thing would be my whiteboards. Those are non-negotiable. Like if I have to change rooms, I'm going to have whiteboards all over my room.
So I've had the privilege of getting to see you teach. So when you are talking about the strategies with the whiteboards, I know exactly what that looks like. Can you describe that in a nutshell for someone who hasn't visited your classroom?
Sure. So students are put into groups of 3, usually randomly, with cards at the beginning of class. So they're in a different group every day, usually. And then I give them problems and they go to the boards, and that's set up differently, but they're working on the boards. The person that has the marker is not supposed to be doing the thinking. They're only supposed to be doing the writing, and the other 2 are directing the thinking. And so it takes the pressure off the person with the pen, but puts pressure on the other 2 on explaining how to do the problem.
So what does that do for you as a teacher?
So for me, I can assess around the room, 10 groups at a time, and I can target misconceptions. I can also highlight different ways students work problems and stop the class, and then kind of have a little gallery walk and let them walk through and see, oh, there's a different way to work this problem, or, oh, this is where we were stuck. Or I can have my students switch groups, and then they can look for misconceptions of the other group, or different strategies on how they work the problem. I can also use it to find the error. So if a group has made an error and another group has mastered, they can switch and help them find their mistake. And then the students can see the correctly worked problem and maybe find their own mistake that way as well.
So I think one question I would have about that is, how do you grade that? If they work that way, how do you put a grade on that?
That's a great question. So I don't grade everything. And when they're working at the boards, I usually don't grade that. But I do have I've started doing this. I have a clipboard with their names on it. And so I can go through and kind of plus minus, or, some kind of coding where they've mastered it, or they're working toward mastery, or they have no clue what they're doing. I can make a note on that. So I know the next day, okay, what do they need from me? And what do I need to see from them to know that they know what they're doing?
So do you think that has shifted student perception of work in math class?
Absolutely. Yes. And it's non-threatening. They're not afraid to make mistakes. They can take risks because they know practice is practice. They're not being graded on practice. They can ask questions. They're not afraid to fail. So that's huge.
That end goal is just talking about it and working through it and figuring it out. The end goal isn't producing the right answer.
Right.
What else would you want to leave people with about teaching and learning in your classroom?
I think so. I think just staying the course. Everything, like when I was thinking about what I would tell my first year self, it's a roller coaster at times. Like everything isn't great all the time. Every lesson doesn't work out like magic and it's all wonderful and rainbows and butterflies and everybody learns and everybody loves math. That is not how it works at all. And so just being able to have a support group that you can bounce ideas off of and will really come alongside you and help you. That's super important. And then just in the classroom, being patient with kids. I have to remind myself sometimes they're kids. Like they're not consistent ever. From day to day, hour to hour, nothing is consistent in their world, which makes it very inconsistent in my world. And so just being patient with them and giving them space to grow, and sometimes just giving them space, like just give them space and come back in a little bit, is super important. And then also, like for my classroom, I change things up quite a bit, but I don't want my colleagues to think that everybody has to teach the same way, because we don't. What works for me in my classroom doesn't necessarily work for my colleagues in their classroom. But I do enjoy going to other people's classrooms and cherry picking things out of what they do.
Absolutely.
To make it work in my room. And so I think there's value in that too, when we can get out and go watch other teachers teach, that we need to do that. Whether it's math or English or history, there's always something that I feel like I can take from other people. And I think that's super important.
I totally agree. There's something magic about watching another teacher at work.
Yes.
And the millions, literally, of decisions they are making. But I also think what you said is so true. Like you can take those things and fit them into your practice, but it comes back to what you said at the very beginning. It has to be authentic to you, to your style as a teacher. And so it's a balancing thing.
It is. It is.
So if a teacher heard you talk about something on this podcast, flipping your classroom, the way you use the whiteboards, claims evidence reasoning, and they were curious about what that actually looked like, what would you say?
Come on and check it out.
Excellent.
My door is always open.
Be sure to join us next time when we'll have a discussion with Amy Flaw about what goes on in the nutrition department here at Pryor Public Schools.